First of all, I want to thank our moderator, the Reverend Amanda Curry, for her message of support and hope. I emailed her on Monday and wondered if she could send along a video greeting in honor of our 185th anniversary that we are celebrating this morning. And because she was supposed to be here in person to celebrate with us, I thought that short word of greeting would be most welcome, and it would soften the blow of not being able to be together or to entertain her. Because no one is here this morning celebrating in person. Instead, we must all celebrate from our homes and be together online. But instead of a greeting, Reverend Curry sent a mini sermon for us, so I'll keep my remarks a little briefer than normal this morning. Reverend Curry focused on Thomas in her message, but I would like to take us in a slightly different direction now. Not necessarily on the characters in our gospel reading, but instead on the situation that they find themselves in. They were locked inside because of fear. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Sadly, it does, doesn't it? Because on the surface, we are locked inside for our own self-protection and for the protection of others as we try and stem the number of infections and deaths from COVID-19. But underneath that surface reason of protection and self-protection, underneath that is fear. The fear that we will get infected, the fear that our loved ones will get infected, the fear that infections will skyrocket and overwhelm our medical system, fear that our former life might be irrevocably changed. But on this anniversary Sunday, as we are called to celebrate 185 years of mission and ministry here at Burns Presbyterian in Kilmartin, in the old township of Mosa, let us remember that we are not alone in our fear. In many ways, the entire world is fearful at this moment. And if we think back on our own history as a congregation, as a worshiping community, I am sure that there were many moments of fearfulness for our forebears too. Arriving from the highlands of Scotland in the early 1830s and having to face the back-breaking work of clearing the forested land that was all around us in order that they might farm it and grow food and survive. Then having to build rudimentary houses and perhaps later on building ones that were a little more comfortable. And even in the midst, though, of facing their very survival in the wilds of southern Ontario at that time, these early settlers, they gathered to worship. And they built a small log church somewhere on the grounds of the cemetery across the road in 1835 or 1836. For some reason, they never completely finished that log church, but then in the early 1840s, a second, more substantial log church was built just east of our current building. In the early 1860s, the congregation again stepped out in faith, purchasing the existing glebe, the land around the church and the manse today, and they were gifted with land for a newer church building. The manse and the stables across the road were built in 1864. And in 1867, a new brick church was erected here on this current site. In 1885, the roof of that church began to leak. And so the congregation decided to replace the existing roof, probably wooden shingles. They decided to replace it with a slate roof. The extra weight, however, was too much for the building, and the walls, they began to crack, and the foundation, and things began to shift. And in 1890, the congregation decided to tear down that church and build a new one on the same site. This one. Imagine all the fear, all the worry, all the anxiety of the congregation around each one of those decisions. And on the human side, there would have been fear throughout all of these years as well. Fear-striking tragedies. Life was never easy as a pioneer settler or as a remote farmer. Accidents, disease, childbirth. I took a walk through the cemetery my first summer here, and I marveled at all the headstones remembering the death of children and young people, often multiple deaths in single families. These two headstones that I'm about to show you, they're hard to read, but the Baxter family, and I'm not sure if this is the same nuclear family or an extended family, but these two headstones are side by side. The first tells of two children, aged 23 and 15, dying less than 8 months apart. The second headstone tells of two Baxter children, aged 13 and 1, dying less than 4 months apart. A third headstone that I took a picture of is from the Leach family, and it chronicles 5 children dying over a period of 17 years, ranging in age from 1 to 11. Imagine the fear, the worry, and the anxiety of those early families, even if death didn't touch their own families. But watching it happen all around them. The Spanish flu, outbreaks of measles and mumps and dysentery, not to mention farm accidents. Then we had World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Fear and anxiety have been around as long as humanity has walked the earth. And in our passage this morning, the disciples too are fearful. Good news does not erase fear. Good news, incredible news, it can ignite hope, but even hope does not eliminate genuine fear. So there they were, in a familiar place, that place where they ate their last meal with Jesus, and yet desperate with unfamiliar fear. An empty tomb, it isn't enough to confirm all that Jesus promised is true. What does the resurrection mean? It means that God still shows up. And the writer of this gospel story, he continues to rehearse and retell elements of that storied and historical witness to God, of God showing up. And Jesus is the latest in that line of stories of God showing up over and over again. Like God finding that first couple, finding Adam and Eve behind those trees. The disciples are found here behind closed doors. They are perplexed by the knowledge they have. Jesus, alive? Risen? And Jesus shows up. He comes and stands in their very midst and says, "Peace be with you." And there's no doubt it was Jesus. They recognize the scars. They see the stripes on his back. They see the hole in his side. And in recognition, John says, they rejoiced. Astonished, ashamed, afraid. The intruder into their hidden and locked place declares to them a must and most needed peace. God is with us. God is still with us. And Jesus, like God breathing life into the first human, breathed on those disciples. The Spirit of God proceeds from him. And in so doing, he opens the eyes of the disciples and he gives them courage, but more importantly, hope. On this anniversary Sunday, when we, in some ways, are locked in our homes, when we are filled with fear and anxiety about the present and the future, we too can draw examples from the history of our ancestors overcoming their fear and their anxiety, working and hoping and building for a better future. On this anniversary Sunday, we too can be astonished. We can be filled with hope as we discover that God is with us, that God is still with us. Jesus is in our midst, declaring, "Peace be with you." And it is that same peace, that he granted those disciples so long ago. And from that peace comes hope. That no matter what life looks or feels like around us, God is still with us. Amen. Our hymn, "Will Your Anchor Hold in the Storms of Life?"